fundamental skills we develop in analyzing tonal music is being able to identify and label the chords that we're presented with. And of course, that means we need to be able to, among other things, locate the root of those chords. Obviously, when chords are in root position, it's very simple. It's always going to be the bottom note. But there are a few things that we have to think about, of course, then when we make chords into inversions. And so I want to show you how to locate the roots of triads and seventh chords in both root position and inverted form here. So on the top line, I've limited this to triads. The second line, I've limited this to seventh chords. And then the third line here is triads and seventh chords, but now on a grand staff, and I can show you how to identify those roots as well. So let's start off with the top row in our triads, okay? The first one's simple enough. It's just in root position, the way we're used to seeing it, and I can see that I've got a fifth here, perfect fifth, and a minor third there, so no problem. I can clearly see that in this case I have an A minor triad. Okay, but now let's go over to this example here. I've got a G here, a B flat, and E flat, but that doesn't quite look like the stack of thirds or the perfect fifth with a third in the middle that I'm used to seeing in root position, right? So I've got to figure out where the root went. It's clearly not in the bass, okay? So there's a long way and a short way. I'll show you the long way first. The long way is just to kind of test each note in the triad to see if placing that note on the bottom of the stack produces the stacked thirds, or the fifth with the third in the middle. It obviously doesn't here with this note, but let's try it now with the B flat on the bottom. Okay, so I'll do the B flat here. I'll keep the E flat where it is here, but because I want the B flat on the bottom, I'm going to need to transplant the G to here. All right. So now I look and I see, do I have thirds here? No, because the gap here is still pretty big, so that doesn't work. So the B flat failed us in terms of it being a candidate for the root in this particular chord. So now we'll try the only one left, the E flat. Okay, so E flat here, G back where I transplanted it, and now I need to transplant the B flat here. And now I have something I recognize. Now I recognize this as stacked thirds, or like the way I like to think about it, a fifth with a third in the middle. And so that tells me that E flat is in fact the root of this triad, okay? So I'm a step closer to being able to label this chord that I've got in blue. So E flat is the root. Let me see if it's a major or a minor. Let's see, E flat to B flat is a perfect fifth, and then E flat to G is a major third. So it is in fact an E flat major chord. But I'm not done yet because I still need to account for the fact that it's in an inverted form. It's got a G in the bass rather than an E flat. Okay, so if I look over here, I see that my G is the third of the chord, so that must mean it's a first inversion. Okay, and of course our figured bass symbol for a first inversion triad is just a 6. So to complete the label, I will add the 6 here, and now that's the full label of this triad. Okay, going over to the next one. I can use that same long way that I did before, but there's actually a shortcut that applies to both first inversion and, as we'll see, second inversion. I could do the thing where I test every possible candidate, or I could just look at where that gap is, right? I've got this in closed position, and I can see, though, that there's a gap of a fourth between these two notes. And if I'm dealing with triads, then the upper note of that gap of a fourth should form my root. Okay, so let's try that first here, then we'll try it over in second inversion. Okay, so let's test my theory. My theory is that the upper note of the gap should form the root. So if I make that the E flat, then the third should be a G. There's a G there. And the fifth should be a B flat. There's a B flat there. Okay, and I end up with the same thing that I had over here. Okay, so that in fact did work in this case. So let's try it now in second inversion, but we'll try it right off the bat. You can see that I've got a gap of a fourth right here. Okay, the C to the F sharp. So let's test my theory. Let's make the F sharp the root. Try that a little more precisely. F sharp. And if F sharp is the root, then the third had better be, oh, come on. The third had better be an A of some kind. And sure enough, I have an A right there. And the fifth had better be a C of some kind. And there's the C right there. So sure enough, using that trick really did allow me to end up with a triad. Okay, so let's go ahead and figure out which kind of triad it is. F sharp to C is a diminished fifth. Okay, so F sharp to A is a minor third. We know that a diminished fifth with a minor third results in a diminished triad. And F sharp I've just identified as the root, so it's an F sharp diminished triad. But again, I'm not done. I need to account for the fact that it's in an inverted form. Second inversion of this triad, second inversion is represented by 6-4. So to complete the label, I will apply 6-4 here. Okay, and that's the label for this triad. All right, So there we go. That is for triads. Now we'll go ahead and look at the seventh chords. As you can see, I've purposely started with a root position seventh chord, right? Where G is the root. Okay, this forms a G minor triad underneath. The G to the F is a minor seventh. Okay, so it's a G minor triad with a minor seventh, right? Or more typically, we would write that as just plain old G minor 7. That's simple enough. The root's at the bottom because I've got stacked thirds. Going next door, though, I don't have stacked thirds. You can see that this here kind of throws off that groove just a little bit. Okay. Now I could use the long method that I used up with the triads, and you can certainly do that where you test out each note as a possible root of the chord, and you keep testing them until you get a full stack of thirds like we had back here. But I'm going to go ahead and show you the shortcut for seventh chords once I've collapsed all these notes into closed position. Do you see how I have here a second? Whenever I see that second, and I've got the seventh chord in closed position, I can pretty well bet that that upper note of this squeezed in interval here is going to form the root of my seventh chord. Okay, so now my upper note here, I'm just checking my clef here, there it is, treble clef. Okay, so the upper note of my seventh chord is an A. So let me see if that works. Okay, I said the upper note of the second should form the root. So if that's true, if A is the root, well then the third should be a C. And sure enough, I have a C here. The fifth should be an E of some kind. Sure enough, I've got an E flat there. And the seventh should be a G of some kind. And there that is there. Well, look at that. Okay. Now I've got it in root position. So now I can more clearly see that an A is the root of this chord. Okay. So what kind of chord is it? All right, well, let's figure that out. A to E flat is a diminished fifth. So it's probably a diminished chord of some kind. Let's make sure. Sure enough, A to C is a minor third. So it's an A diminished something, okay? And A now to G is a minor seventh, okay? So it's an A diminished minor seventh chord, but hang on just a second before I get too carried away. Remember, I have to account for the inversion when I'm providing the analysis. Notice that the C is in the base of my original chord. C forms the chordal third, so this is actually in a first inversion. Okay, so I can't represent it using a 7 because that implies a root position. I have to use the first inversion form of this, so that's going to be a 6, 5. Okay, remember that a seventh chord in first inversion. The figured base for that is 6, 5. Okay, so it's an A diminished minor 6, 5. But remember, instead of writing diminished minor, we tend to abbreviate that as A half diminished, and I'll keep the 6, 5. Okay, so that is the chord we have here. Okay, now moving on next door here, let's see if we can use that second thing again, right? I have a C sharp to a D now. Again, yep, still in treble clef. I always go back and check my clef just so I don't get too so buried I forget to analyze the notes correctly. So C sharp up to a D, I'll bet you that D is going to form the root of the chord. Let's go ahead and try it out. Okay, so we'll keep the D as the root. Keep the D as the root. We will keep the F sharp where it was. We will transplant the A to the top here. By this is also helping me make sure that it is in fact D as the root because I should stack thirds here. And then the C sharp should go here. And that all seems to work out. All the notes are accounted for, and I can see that this is now in root position, so D must be the root of the chord, okay? So I have a D to an A, that's a perfect fifth. D to F sharp is a major third. That means it's a D major something. Now D to a C sharp is a major seventh, but I'm not going to write down the 7. I'm going to make sure that I've got the correct inversion. In fact, it is not a D at the bottom of the original chord. It's an A, which we see over here forms the fifth. So that means with the fifth in the bottom, that means it's a second inversion. And I know that a second inversion, seventh chord, is represented using the figured base by 4-3. So it's a D major with a major seventh, but I'm going to represent that as a 4-3. The more standard way of writing this, of course, is D major with a 4-3. Okay, so that's that one. All right, and now finally, our final seventh chord in closed position. I'm going to try my second trick again. G to A. That forms a second. I'll bet you anything that A is the root of the chord. So let's try it out. A, which means I should have a C something. Yep, sure enough, C sharp as the third. I should have an E something as a fifth, and there it is. There's the E. I will transplant the G to this octave here. And yep, that looks like a well-organized root position seventh chord. So A is my root. A to E is a fifth. A to C sharp is a major third, so it's an A major something. G on the top. A to G is a minor seventh, right? But I'm not going to write 7. I'm going to account for the fact that there's something else in the bass. I see that it's the chordal seventh in the bass, which means it's the third way of messing with the seventh chord, or the third inversion. And the third inversion is represented by 4-2, or just plain old 2. Okay? So this is an A major minor 2 chord. All right, so that's how I do, that's how I find the root when I'm dealing with triads and with seventh chords. So now, how do I deal with this open position? Well, this is a little trickier until you realize you can just collapse everything, right? I'm going to take all these big spaced out notes and I'm going to condense them from open position to closed position. I do have to make sure when I'm doing that first condensation that I leave the lowest note of the group, the note in the bass, I leave that in the bass so that I don't get too muddled when I'm trying to figure out the inversion later down the road, okay? So in this example, I'm going to keep the C in the bass, and I'm going to change octaves for all the other stuff so that I can get this whole thing in closed position, right? I think I'll probably stay in closed position if I keep the G right where it is here. And then I'll take the E, instead of writing it, above middle C, I'll move it down here. And then this here is a C. Huh, interesting. I'll write that here. And then when I look at this, now down here, I see that I've got what looks like a triad, but then what's this note here? What's this doing here? Oh, wait, it's just a doubling. It's just a repetition of the C that I already have, right? So in terms of analyzing the chord, the fact that I have another of the same pitch isn't going to make a difference to the identity of the chord, okay? So I'll ignore that C, and then I'll just deal with this stuff here. So C to G forms a perfect fifth. C to E forms a major third. So it turns out this thing is just a C major triad. Hello all, I'm cutting in here because in the first version of this video, as I continued through the rest of these open position chords, I actually made a couple of pretty glaring errors, which I didn't notice, but a really keen-eyed student caught them, and so I'm coming back and I'm going to go ahead and redo these. So we're going to pick this up from the C major chord we've already analyzed, and we're going to move over to this next one here, using the similar process that we've been talking about in terms of condensing the chords down to closed position so we can better identify the root and then the inversion as well. Okay, so we'll start that process here. Here we have a B at the bottom of this really tall stack of notes here, so we'll go ahead and condense that. So here's the B. The G sharp here looks like it's probably close enough to manage, so we'll keep that where it is. The F is pretty high up here, so I'll transplant it down to this octave. And then the D I'll also move down as well. Okay, so it looks like I probably have a seventh chord of some kind. They're 4 completely different pitches, right? But it doesn't look like it's in root position because I've got this funky looking second here, right? But if this is in fact a seventh chord, I've just learned a trick for that, whereas I can take the upper note of that second and treat it as the root of the chord. Well, let's see if that works. Let's make G sharp our root, or at least our root on trial. For convenience sake, I'll just go ahead and move it down here. Okay, G sharp. If G sharp is the root, that means a B of some kind should act as the third. Okay, well, I've got a B in the inventory, so I'll go ahead and use that. If G sharp is the root, that means a D of some kind should form the fifth. There's a D. And then the seventh should be an F of some kind. And sure enough, I've got an F right there. Okay, so it turns out that the G sharp is in fact the root of this chord. All right, now we have to make sure that we account for the correct inversion. So when we go back and do the final analysis, we have to remember that the third is in the bass. All right, but before we do that, let's go ahead and figure out what kind of chord we've got here. All right, so let's figure out the underlying triad since it's a seventh chord. The G sharp to a D forms a diminished fifth. All right, G sharp to B is a minor third. So it turns out that the underlying triad for this thing is a diminished triad. So I'm safe so far with my labeling in terms of using a lowercase g. It's a G sharp, right? And then the underlying triad is diminished. Right, so far so good. But let's not forget about that that inversion, right? We've got the B in the bass, which we've figured out is a chordal third. So it's going to be a seventh chord with the third in the bass, so it's going to be in 6-5 position, right? So I know that it's going to be some kind of 6-5. I just have to make sure that I account for the correct seventh as well. Remember, we determined that the underlying triad was diminished, but we have to account for this F here, right? So what kind of seventh is that? Well, you may be tempted to just jump to the idea that it's a minor seventh, but that's not actually the case, right? Let's walk through this. The easiest thing to figure out may not be the seventh, but the octave is pretty easy. So if I jump up from a G sharp to another G sharp, that's going to be a perfect octave, of course. If I want to shrink that interval from an octave to a major seventh by moving the upper note, well, I move the upper G sharp down a half step, but actually that looks like a G on the keyboard, but since it's some kind of seventh, I need to call it some kind of F. So it's actually an F double sharp that forms the major seventh. Well, okay, fine. Let's take that down another half step to F sharp. Well, F sharp forms a minor seventh with the G sharp below, and this thing here is an F natural. So it's not going to be a minor seventh, it's going to be a seventh that's one half step smaller than that, so it's going to be a diminished seventh, right? So it turns out that this is actually a fully diminished seventh chord, right? But because of the third being in the bass, then it's going to be in 6-5 position, right? So I could call this the mouthful of G sharp diminished to account for the triad, diminished to account for the seventh, and because it's in first inversion, it's in 6-5 position. Of course, we wouldn't say it that way. We wouldn't typically label it that way. The full label for this would be a G sharp. The diminished stands for fully diminished there, 6-5. Okay? So that's that one there. All right, now moving on to the next chord. I'm going to apply the same principles, even though this chord looks a little bit weird because, so many notes are so high, at least on first impression, okay? But that's okay. I can use my same process. We'll take the B flat, make sure we continue to treat it as the bass. Okay, the E flat seems a little bit high for where the B flat is, so I'm going to bring it down an octave. This D I'm also going to pull down to here. And then the G flat I'll pull down as well. Okay. And now I have something that looks, again, a little bit more manageable. And I'm thinking it's a seventh chord. Again, I've got 4 different pitches. And somewhere in this thing, I've got a second, which suggests to me that it's a seventh chord in an inverted format somehow. And because of that second trick, I can, go forward with the assumption that maybe this E flat here is the root of the chord. So let's rewrite the chord with the E flat as the root. If that's the root, then a G of some kind should be the third. Sure enough, I have a G flat. Okay. A B of some kind should be the fifth. I have a B flat here. And then a D of some kind should form the seventh. And yep, I've got a D right there. Okay. So it turns out that E flat is in fact the correct root of this chord. All right. So let's figure out what kind of underlying triad we have. E flat to B flat is a perfect fifth. E flat to G flat is a minor third, so I know that my underlying triad is an E flat minor. Now let's figure out the quality of the seventh. E flat to D is a major seventh, so it's an E flat minor with a major seventh, but I'm not going to label it 7 because I need to account for the correct bass note. Well, it turns out that the bass note is the 5th of the chord, right? So it's going to actually be in 4-3 position. Right? 5th of the chord means it's the second inversion, 7th chord, and for the label for that we use is 4-3. So that's my label for this chord, E flat minor major 4-3. All right, and then finally we've got this thing here, right? Lots of sharps, but that's okay. I think we can handle this. All right, let's go ahead and condense everything. Let's keep the E sharp where it is. The A looks like it's within spitting distance, so we'll leave that. Okay. Now here we have another E sharp. Remember back in the C chord, we had the doubled note, which didn't end up changing the identity of the chord. So I'm going to go ahead and ignore that E sharp here since I've already accounted for it down here. All right. But I am going to pay attention to this C sharp here and bring it down. Okay, to within reach of the other notes here. All right. So now this, to me, it looks like I've only got 3 distinct notes, and it looks like it's probably a triad, right? I want to be sure, so I'll have to do some rearranging, but wait a second. Remember with triads, we realize that in inverted form, once we make it in closed position, we will see that 4th, right? And if we see that 4th, we can probably bet that the upper note of that 4th forms the root of the chord. Well, let's test that theory. Here we go. We'll make A the root, If A is the root, then the third should be some kind of C. I've got a C sharp here, all right? And the fifth should be some kind of E. Sure enough, that E sharp fits the bill. Okay, so it is in fact a triad based on A. Well, what kind of triad? Well, let's look. A to E sharp is actually an augmented fifth. And then A to C sharp is a major third, right? So that means I actually have an A augmented triad, but it's in position, isn't it? Or rather, it's in an inversion. It turns out that the E sharp is on the bottom. E sharp is the chordal fifth, and so it's an A augmented triad with an E sharp in the bass. That E sharp is the fifth. Well, okay, that makes it second inversion, right? And our label for second inversion triads is 6, 4. All right, and that's the identity of that chord. So hopefully this helps you see how even with open position chords, we can still, once we condense them into closed position, find the root and then find the inversion as well.